Have you ever noticed that in almost every group, there is one person who doesn't join the whispering? When the conversation tilts towards someone who isn't there, when the laughter sharpens just slightly, when people lean in, hungry for the next detail, that person stays quiet. They don't ask follow-up questions. They don't nod along. They don't offer their own story to add fuel. Sometimes they just listen. Sometimes they gently disengage, checking their phone, turning back to their work, letting the moment pass without them. And we tend to misunderstand them. We assume they're shy, or socially awkward, or maybe a little aloof. Too good for the group dynamic. But what if that silence isn't hesitation? What if it's perception? Because while everyone else is focused on the story being told, the quiet person is often noticing something else entirely. The tone, the intent, the shift in loyalty that happens when someone's name enters the room without them. They understand something subtle about human nature, that how people speak about others is never just about the others, so they don't rush to participate, not because they have nothing to say, but because they're choosing what not to say. And that choice in a world fueled by noise and opinion is far rarer than it looks. To understand the quiet person, we first have to understand everyone else, and why gossip pulls at us so strongly in the first place. Because the truth is, gossip isn't a modern flaw, it's an ancient feature. For most of human history, we lived in small interdependent groups where survival depended less on strength and more on social knowledge. Who could be trusted? Who cheated? Who shared? Who betrayed? In those environments, information about people was as vital as information about predators or food. Evolutionary psychologists have even suggested that gossip functioned as a kind of social grooming, the verbal equivalent of primates picking through each other's fur. It created bonds. It reinforced norms. It signaled loyalty. When we exchanged stories about others, our brains rewarded us with small bursts of dopamine and oxytocin, the chemistry of connection. And that wiring never disappeared. Even today, when someone leans in and says, "Did you hear about?" your attention sharpens automatically. You feel included, inside, chosen. It's the ancient brain lighting up. This matters. This is social survival. And to be clear, not all gossip is malicious. At moderate levels, it still helps communities share warnings, coordinate expectations, and understand group dynamics. But here's where the quiet person diverges. They sense the difference between information and indulgence, between awareness and appetite. They recognize that the same instinct that once protected tribes can, in modern life, just as easily erode trust. And once you see that mechanism clearly, the pull, the reward, the subtle cost, participation stops feeling automatic. You start choosing. If gossip began as a survival tool, modern life has quietly rewired what it's used for. In small tribes, reputation traveled slowly and locally. A story might circle a campfire, shift a few alliances, then settle. Today, reputation moves at digital speed, amplified, archived, and often stripped of context. The stakes are no longer just social belonging. They're visibility, status, and permanence. In many spaces now, gossip isn't really about understanding people. It's about positioning around them. Subtle judgments become social currency. Who's failing? Who's thriving? Who's embarrassing? Who's enviable? Each exchange quietly answers an unspoken question: where do I stand compared to them? And in a culture saturated with metrics, followers, likes, screenshots, viral moments, that comparison becomes constant. Social media intensifies this distortion. Private observations become public narratives. A misstep becomes content. A rumor becomes a thread. And humiliation, once fleeting, can now be replayed indefinitely. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a reputation economy, where attention attaches to identity and negative information spreads fastest. The quiet person sees this shift. They understand that in a world where stories about people travel farther and last longer than ever, participation carries new risk. Not just moral risk, but reputational risk, because the line between listener and amplifier has blurred. A nod, a comment, a share, each becomes part of the record. So while others experience gossip as harmless bonding, the non-gossiper often experiences it as exposure. They're aware that every conversation leaves a trace, not only about the person discussed, but about the people discussing. And once you notice how easily narratives detach from truth in modern social life, restraint stops feeling passive. It starts to feel protective. It's tempting to assume that people who avoid gossip are simply more virtuous, right? More mature, more kind, more evolved. But psychology rarely works in clean moral categories. The truth is, the same outward behaviour, staying silent about others, can come from very different inner worlds. Some non-gossipers are guided primarily by moral integrity. They hold a clear internal rule. If someone isn't present, they don't discuss them. For these individuals, restraint feels aligned with identity. Speaking ill of others would create dissonance with how they see themselves. Fair, consistent, trustworthy. Others are driven less by morality and more by privacy boundaries. They view personal information, theirs or anyone else's, as inherently off-limits. Their silence isn't about judgment, it's about territory. What belongs to someone's private life should stay there. There are also observational introverts, people whose attention naturally orients toward ideas, patterns, or environments, rather than interpersonal drama. They don't avoid gossip out of principle. They simply find it uninteresting, even mentally cluttering. Their disengagement reflects preference, not virtue. And then there are those shaped by experience, individuals who have been the subject of rumours, exclusion, or betrayal, often develop a deep aversion to repeating that harm. Their silence carries memory. They know firsthand how quickly a narrative can distort a life. What matters is this: non-gossiping is not a single personality type. It's a behaviour with multiple psychological pathways. Understanding that distinction prevents romanticising silence and helps us see that behind the quiet person in the room may be integrity, boundaries, temperament, or history, sometimes all four at once. At the core of many non-gossipers lies a psychological trait that's easy to admire but harder to define. Integrity. Not in the moralistic sense of being good, but in the structural sense of being consistent. Their private judgments and public behaviour align. What they would say in someone's absence is not meaningfully different from what they would say in their presence. That alignment matters because humans carry an internal model of self, a sense of who we are across situations. When people gossip freely, especially in ways that contradict their outward warmth, it creates subtle dissonance inside that model. Most tolerate it, some don't. For the integrity-oriented mind, that fracture feels costly. There's also another layer, what we might call the reputation mind, the capacity to forecast how words travel and what they imply about the speaker. Non-gossipers tend to think in longer arcs. They intuit that every comment about an absent person becomes data about them, their discretion, loyalty, restraint. So they treat speech as reputational investment. Short-term bonding rarely outweighs long-term trust. This is why restraint often looks like quiet confidence. They're less tempted by the immediate social reward, the laugh, the agreement, the shared disdain, because their valuation system is different. Psychologically, it resembles delayed gratification, preserving credibility now to sustain relational security later. And so the mind becomes, in effect, a vault, not secretive, not guarded, but selective about what leaves. Because integrity, once spoken away, is far harder to retrieve than silence ever is. There is another pathway into silence that has less to do with principles and more to do with perception. The capacity to imagine the inner life of someone who isn't in the room. Psychologists call this theory of mind, the ability to represent another person's thoughts, feelings, and perspective. Most adults possess it to some degree, but in some individuals, it operates with unusual vividness. When others laugh about someone's mistake or speculate about their choices, the non-gossiper doesn't just hear a story, they simulate the experience from the other side. What would it feel like to have that moment reduced to a punchline? To have a rumour circulating that you can't correct? To be absent while your identity is being edited? That simulation creates friction. Words that feel light to others feel heavier to them. For many, this sensitivity is shaped by memory. People who have been misrepresented, excluded, or quietly judged often carry what we might call a memory of social harm, an imprint of how quickly narratives detach from truth. They know that most gossip doesn't describe a person, it compresses them, a complex life flattened into a convenient trait. So restraint becomes protective empathy. They resist participating not because they believe others are flawless, but because they understand how partial every social snapshot is. Humans are contextual beings, shaped by pressures, histories, invisible constraints. To evaluate them from fragments feels intellectually and emotionally insufficient. This is why non-gossipers often tolerate uncertainty better. They're comfortable saying, "I don't really know enough." In cultures that reward instant opinions, that sentence can sound passive, but psychologically, it reflects humility, an acceptance that understanding a person requires proximity, not hearsay. And once you internalize how easily stories about people can distort them, silence stops being avoidance. It becomes respect. It's easy to frame silence as purely virtuous, but in real social life, restraint carries trade-offs. Because gossip, for all its risks, also serves as a bonding ritual. Sharing mild judgments or private observations often signals familiarity. We're close enough to speak freely about others. When someone consistently declines that ritual, the group can register distance, not as hostility, but as emotional reserve. This creates what we might call the warmth-trust paradox. Non-gossipers are usually perceived as highly trustworthy, discreet, reliable, safe, but not always as warm, not always as one of us. In fast-forming social environments, workplaces, friend groups, networks, that distinction matters. Warmth tends to invite inclusion, trust tends to follow familiarity. When familiarity develops slowly, access can too. There's also an informational cost. Gossip functions informally as a map of alliances, tensions, and reputational shifts. People who avoid it entirely may miss early signals about conflicts or risks within a group. In organizational settings, this can translate into less political awareness, fewer insights into who influences whom, or where loyalties lie. None of this means non-gossipers are disadvantaged by default. Many build deep, stable relationships precisely because of their discretion, but the path is different. Bonding may take longer. Social positioning may be less visible. They're often respected before they're fully included. So the silence that protects integrity can also slow belonging. A subtle cost, rarely discussed but quietly real. Not all silence around gossip comes from the same psychological place. From the outside, restraint can look identical, a person who doesn't speak about others. But internally, the motive can differ in ways that matter. Healthy silence is grounded in choice. The person could speak, they simply decide not to. They're still comfortable addressing issues directly with someone involved. They still express opinions when relevant. They still process emotions through appropriate channels. Their restraint is selective, not global. It reflects boundaries. I don't discuss people who aren't here. Avoidant silence, by contrast, is driven less by principle and more by fear. Fear of conflict, fear of being exposed, fear of saying something wrong. Individuals here may avoid not only gossip, but also honest interpersonal dialogue. They withdraw from evaluative conversations altogether, even necessary ones. What looks like discretion may actually be suppression, opinions unspoken, tensions unaddressed, discomfort internalized. Psychologically, the difference shows up in flexibility. Healthy silencers can shift modes: private restraint, direct feedback, open discussion, depending on context. Avoidant silencers remain globally quiet, even when clarity or advocacy is needed. Silence becomes safety rather than discernment. This distinction matters because gossip avoidance alone doesn't guarantee relational maturity. Someone can refuse to speak about others and still struggle with direct communication or boundary setting. Conversely, someone can occasionally discuss others in constructive ways and remain psychologically healthy. So the question isn't simply, do they gossip? It's, can they engage honestly when it counts? When silence is chosen, it reflects strength. When it's compulsory, it reflects protection. Beyond ethics or empathy, many non-gossipers develop something quieter and more strategic: an economy of speech. They understand that attention, credibility, and mental bandwidth are finite, and that what you repeatedly talk about shapes how others perceive you, so they choose selectively. In social settings where gossip begins to circulate, they often use minimal responses, neutral acknowledgements, brief pauses, gentle topic shifts, no visible judgment, no curiosity cues. Psychologically, this matters because gossip thrives on reinforcement. It needs reaction, surprise, laughter, outrage, to sustain momentum. Without that fuel, it dissipates. The conversation moves elsewhere. This restraint also creates informational asymmetry. While others broadcast their perceptions freely, the selective speaker reveals little. Over time, this tends to increase perceived discretion and stability. People notice who doesn't relay what they hear, and trust accumulates around that pattern. There's also a cognitive advantage. Conversations centered on absent individuals often spiral into speculation, motives, flaws, hypotheticals. By opting out, the selective speaker preserves mental space. They track dynamics without being absorbed by them: who speaks about whom, who defends, who exaggerates. The social map becomes clearer precisely because they aren't contributing noise to it. In leadership research, a similar pattern appears. Individuals seen as composed and judicious with words are often granted higher credibility, not because they speak less overall, but because they speak about people less casually. Selective speech isn't withdrawal, it's calibration. And over time, that calibration quietly shapes reputation, not through what is said, but through what consistently isn't. If you step back far enough, the quiet person in the room is not just avoiding gossip. They're opting out of a particular way of relating, one built on comparison, speculation, and the constant monitoring of who stands where. Because when you stop discussing people in their absence, something subtle shifts inside. The background anxiety, what do they say about me when I'm not there, begins to loosen. You recognize that most reputational chatter is transient, reactive, and rarely complete, and your sense of self becomes less tethered to those currents. This is what we might call a mature social mind, not indifferent to others, but less preoccupied with judging them, not silent from fear, but selective from clarity. Relationships formed here tend to feel different. They revolve more around shared ideas, experiences, and values than shared targets. There's less urgency to position, less need to align against someone else. Connection becomes additive rather than comparative. So the next time you notice yourself in a conversation drifting towards someone who isn't present, pause for a moment. Notice the pull. Notice the choice. You can follow the noise, or you can practice the quieter strength of restraint. If this perspective resonated with you, you might feel at home here. We explore the deeper patterns of human behavior and inner growth on this channel. Consider subscribing and joining the conversation. And I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever chosen silence in a situation where others expected you to join in? What did you notice about yourself or about them? Share your experience in the comments. Thank you for watching.